Welcome everyone, nice to see you here. I'm Joe Hendricks. I teach an English program and am the organizer of the Fall Faculty Series. So every year the faculty get together, sit down and decide on a topic or theme for the annual presentation series. And this year, just a couple of weeks ago, was the 20th anniversary of 9/11. So that's our theme. I think it's a particularly good theme because all of our traditional age students live in an entirely post-9/11 world. And all the information they have and experiences are secondhand, right? So I hope our students and everyone else, of course, walks away from our presentation with new questions and critical thinking about the variety of long-term effects that 9/11 has had on all of us, and the way it continues to shape the United States. After our presentation, we'll have a few minutes for questions or discussion. If you're live streaming on YouTube, you can type into the comments and it will be relayed to us at the end. There's cookies and lemonade over there for Snacks Champions. Let me introduce our first speaker, Dr. Jim Jacobs. He's an associate professor in the computer science program. He's been with us since 2020. Prior to Mount Mercy, let's see if I can get it right, Jim was a professor and researcher of computer science for about a decade, lead engineer at Sky
Correct.
For 9 years. Former Marine.
Former Marine.
For 9 years. And it sounds like you've been to almost every continent.
I've been to 4 of the 7.
Over half. So.
Yep, over half of the
So please help me welcome Jim Jacobs.
All right. Well, thank you. Yeah, when they announced this, I had second doubts of whether or not I should present any of the material I am today. Hopefully, it does do some good, because that's really the point. When I looked at 9/11, when that happened, I'd already seen a lot before that came about. It was a surprise to most. It wasn't necessarily a surprise to me. I saw it as we're going to keep going. And ultimately, that was a pivot point from the nation's perspective. But we were involved in a lot of things beforehand, and I want to try to express what those are. I want to do it logically, and that's was my concern. There's a lot of emotions tied to a lot of these things, so I will try to stay there. I will use the collective we, as far as the Marines and everything else, because it was a group effort. If I do transition to I or things of that nature, I will try to correct myself, because I want to try to avoid the I's as much as I can. But that's who I'm really referring to as we. And if I transition from one group to another and it isn't clear, just let me know, so I'll try to do that. But, so generally, I'll start with 9/11, and then I'm going to back up. Starting in the 1970s, a quick history lesson to get to where I got involved, which is in the 1990s. And then we'll get to 2001, and then we'll talk about solutions, because really that's where I like to go. How do we solve it, and how do we move forward? If we know the history and we know the information, hopefully we can do at least something and do that. And then I do want to talk about the costs after that and reference some things from then to the present on how we just don't see how much this costs to everybody involved. So I was at SkyTel. I was in Jackson, Mississippi, right there on the map. I was working. One of the guys that was down the hall, because when I work, I'm just focused on what I'm doing. They came in and said, one of the towers just got hit. I said, okay, at first, nobody knows if it's an accident or what's going on. That was the first knowledge that we had what was going on, or what happened. We didn't know what was going on. And then a little later, same person comes in, the second tower just got hit. And now it became real. You're like, this wasn't an accident. Somebody just didn't fly a plane and make a mistake. It was intentional. And the second one came in, and then they said CNN and everybody else started covering all of it. And most of the other presentations will cover a good portion of that, I believe. So I went here. We ended up having to evacuate the building. we had a senator in that same building in One Jackson Place in Jackson, Mississippi, and they were concerned whether or not it was going to be a larger attack. In essence, they were going to attack various political institutions, and a senator would be one of those. So they just happened to be on the 6th floor, and we were on the 7th floor. So we had to evacuate the whole building just in case it was going to be a larger attack. From there, I want to back up. Because when we see history, we usually see it from a textbook. My daughter, my wife asked her, this last week, what did you learn about 9/11, or not 9/11, Persian Gulf War, and things of that nature, of the history? She knew nothing about it, right? And it's the same with some of these. The people that were alive during that time, these were critical events that shaped people's decisions, and still have an effect on you today, and will have an effect on you from now on because of the pivot that has been made. But before this time frame, internationally, I perceive that we were a beacon of hope for most folks. In essence, we were that new nation that accepted everybody. Whether it was true or not, that's a different story, but at least that perception was there. So having somebody attack us from that perspective wasn't really reasonable. So here in 1970s, 1973 and 74 was OPEC. They did, and then we say an embargo, but ultimately they just did trade restrictions on oil. Supply and demand, business folks, you reduce supply, demand stayed constant, what happens? The price goes up. And since we are a nation that's been driven by the car, if you look at the campaign promises in the 1950s, one car in everybody's garage. That was the statement. We built the interstates, we built all those systems, so we were built around the car, and ultimately gasoline and diesel fuel fueled that relationship. So it was a huge effect for us, whereas on other nations where the populations are more condensed, and they were still on public transit and all kinds of other, it wasn't as big of a deal as it was for us. But it did start shaping the American mindset, because now they're waiting in line to get an essential resource to get to work and do their job and do all the rest of those. And it started shaping, hey, we got to pay attention to what's going on in this region. Whereas before, we didn't care, right? It was just trade and it just happened. So this started changing. Another critical event is 1979, the Iranian Revolution. The Iranians previous to that were considered an ally. Well, this changed. And that regime changed. So now you have Iraq, the ally in the region, and the US funds the opposition. And we'll find out we fund the other side too, but at the end, this is where we started, right? 1979, Soviet Union, our adversaries, the capitalist adversaries, the communists, they invade Afghanistan. We think of the Afghan war today that we just walked away from, but there's a lot of history, and people say, hey, Afghani's been at war a lot longer than everybody else. You should kind of stay out of that dirt. There's really no reason to be there. Okay. But at the same time, we decide, hey, let's fund their opposition too. Because we had an enemy, the Soviets. We didn't go directly at war, but hey, so what do? Well, we get the jihads. And I'm bad at enunciating that, but Mujahideen, thank you. So at the end, we fund them. Here we go. And they were the freedom fighters, so we put a name on it and said, oh, they're fighting for freedom. And they were fighting for their own cause. And we'll find out that that's really where this triangle starts coming back to haunt us later on. But there's the images. There's a Marine right there raiding the embassy. And it was big news. Well, ultimately, Carter had to, really, he said he was voted out, but The resignation was pretty much imminent because of this event. And then soon, right after Reagan was voted in, the hostages were released within short order. But that's what was happening. So the Reagan years, ultimately funding the opposition. We were at war with everything. But we started off Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq. Now, Afghanistan, I showed the Stinger missile because we actually gave military hardware to that group. Typically, that's frowned upon, right? Because ultimately those weapons end up shooting down Americans at some point. We knew that from before. Vietnam, World War II, it doesn't matter. They all come around back to haunt our own soldiers. So usually we don't do that, but in this case, the adversaries and the jihadists that were fighting the Soviets, they weren't doing very well. And we intersected and said, here's something you can get rid of the Soviet air power with, and ultimately led to that demise. Other things that have happened, Egypt, 1981, the Sadat assassination, again, with the alternate groups starting to rise up, showing that they have power or wanting to have power. 1987, the Stark. Now, most people said at that time it was considered an accident, but the Iraqis shot 2 Exocet missiles into the USS Stark, the people we were funding to fight the other war. Was it an accident? Well, they claimed so, and we believed them. Well, what happens a couple years later? Maybe this was an accident, maybe it was a test to see whether or not you can actually defeat the armada that's sitting outside your door. 1987, Palestinian uprising. Right, so ultimately that's what Intifada means, right, is ultimately the uprising. The Islamic uprising in the general sense across the board started to take shape. The Iran-Contra scandal, this was us ultimately funding, selling weapons to the Iranians. Again, we're funding the Iraqis, and now we're funding the other side. Okay, interesting, right? But ultimately the sale, the money was going to go to the Contras and then fund their anti-communist movements. So that's why it was justified. Again, all of these things wrap around this capitalist versus communist type of concept outside of the religious order here. But at least from a US perspective, that's why we're funding these things. It was clearly a political battle between those two superpowers. The war on drugs got wrapped into a whole bunch of different things. If you untangle all that web of money, yeah, there's our money going into drug dealers to fight other drug dealers, and we did all kinds of interesting things through that period of time. So ultimately, you go look at the 80s and you start saying there's a lot of stuff going on, especially from the Reagan era. I just came up with this today, so forgive me if I overstep a little bit. But before, you looked at our presidential leaders, had to have military backgrounds. Ronald Reagan was an actor. He had a lot of charisma, so clearly he got a lot of backing, and he could actually get people to follow the Republican Party. But you have to show that you're powerful, especially in the Republican Party. Show that I'm there. War is the way to do that. You go out there, it rallies everybody behind you, and you're like, oh, I got an adversary, communism. Who's going to argue with me? You're a communist then. Yeah, and everybody else is against them, so yeah, you're not going to fall into that concept. But we went through this. Ollie North is the Marine in there who was ultimately tried through Congress and through this Iran-Contra scandal, if you're not familiar with them. The uprising there as well. What is quintessential here is the photos, and I don't have, at that time we didn't have digital cameras and everything else, so I don't have some of the pictures of the Somalis later on throwing rocks at me, but I will mention those. Ultimately, their weapon was exactly that. If you brought a weapon out there, you were a combatant. If you threw a rock, you're just a rock-throwing teenager. So clearly they've learned, and they said in Somalia, we faced this same concept later on of throwing rocks. Okay, they were using the David and Goliath slings, so they would put some extra some extra force to it. Over to the right, I have some AlQaeda leaders. 1988, AlQaeda, the basis is formed. Okay, Osama bin Laden is one of those folks. You got to look through the 80s; they're getting more and more powerful, fighting the Soviets. The Soviets are on their way out; they're going to retreat in 1989. So now they're looking and saying, we're the winners, right? They're getting and they're forming real groups, whereas before it was a whole bunch of different tribes and all kinds of other things. They were more likely to fight each other than they were to fight anybody else. But now they're actually consolidating as a group, which is a critical change in there. Now this list is actually a whole bunch of those that have been killed and captured over time, but it gives you a quick glimpse of how diverse this group was. They were in Somalia. They were all through Asia. I said they had leaders through this group to cause hate and discontent in a lot of different areas. So that's what that image goes for. The other thing in 1989, 1991, we saw the retreat from Afghanistan, 1989, and then the fall of the wall. The Berlin Wall happens. And everybody's, communism is slowly losing. So now you had two superpowers to aim at. One of them just chose the other one, and that's the philosophy that we're following: the enemy of my enemy is my friends. But what happens when the other enemy disappears?
Then you're not needed.
Then you're not needed, and then we abandon and we walk away. And then they're left to their own to figure out what to do next. Whereas if we kept on our promise and kept our relationships, it might have ended differently. And we might have went down a different path. But instead, we chose this philosophy, and then as soon as the Soviet Union starts falling, we're like, war's over. And as far as America's concerned, that's all we saw. We didn't see the world as it was changing, right? And so now we're at 1991. 1990s. So we get out of the 80s and we start a new decade. We're at the end of that era, and a good portion of the communist regime is falling apart. I'm not too worried about that. 1989, 1990, this is where I started. So I was out in Camp Pendleton, California, and I was actually in this small month infantry training because every Marine had to be an infantryman. That was General Gray's philosophy at the time. So we had boot camp, that's 3 months. We added another month so everybody could shoot, move, and communicate. So I'm out there, and the sergeants and the leadership at the time come running in, wake us all up at 3 in the morning. We're going, right? We're going. Blah. So we get all out there. We get all our stuff. We're packing it up, all those things that we need to go. And then they're like, yeah, we just invaded Panama. Those that were, kind of knowledgeable myself, second guessing and like, you're not sending us anywhere, But at the same time, the whole point was that's how this works. Somebody calls us, we move. We don't get the choice to make a decision. You wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning, we grab our gear and we're gone. Right? But Operation Just Cause, I will say, why did we invade Panama? Because we didn't like what was happening there. So we decided, hey, let's invade it. Now you could sit there and say, and I said there was talk and rumors about Saddam Hussein talked to a couple of the embassy workers before the invasion. And there was rumors because they kept all of this correspondence secret. So everybody could speculate all kinds of stuff of what really happened. But the speculation was Saddam Hussein actually asked, because as soon as he saw this event, I'm running out of money. There's a lot of money right there in Kuwait. You just invaded another country? Even if this conversation didn't happen, you could see the corollaries in somebody else's head. America can do it. So the question was probably more like, and this is the way it's usually phrased, is he asked the question and the ambassador said, we don't get involved in Arab affairs. Because that was our policy at the time. We do not get involved. We do, but we don't get directly involved. So ultimately, it wasn't a green light, but it wasn't a red light either of, no, yeah, you're not doing that, and you'll have consequences. So what does he do? Well, he rolls into Kuwait. So I'm here. I had finished my time as a communication technician, so that's what my title or my MOS was, fixed radios. And so part of the trio, shoot, move, and communicate, I was the guy that kept all the communication running. All right. So at the end, a pretty important position where I could be, and pretty smart guy, so I ended up putting myself in places where I needed to be. But in 1990, he invades. I'm there. I was at the end. I actually accidentally got to go to Desert Shield, Desert Storm, because they weren't really sending new folks, but my unit, 3rd Amphibious Assault Battalion, was already gone from the West Coast. So when I got to Camp Pendleton, I checked in, they're like, your unit's gone, go to Subunit 1. And Subunit 1 was just a holder for us to actually wait for a plane to fly. So it was just a happenstance. I was supposed to actually go to a platoon, which I end up going with back to the same area, but I was supposed to go to them, and I would have bypassed this whole speech, I guess, from this perspective. So it ended up just being happenstance that I ended up going. But Desert Storm looked like this. We had Desert Shield, so we were all masked up. And it was supposed to be the mother of all wars. That's the way it was built. We had a whole bunch of tanks on both sides and a whole bunch of folks in the dirt. I put the Scorpion up here because when you look at this from a reverse perspective, we used to throw Scorpions, as we found them in the desert, into a 55-gallon drum. We'd find them, they'd be under the rack or the cots or whatever we were sleeping on, in the holes that we were digging, and we would just throw them in there, right? Ultimately, over time, there's only one Scorpion left in that bucket. And this is ultimately what happened to us. The Marines, we were Scorpions. The other side, Scorpions. One of us is getting to go home. We're just pitted inside the same container. So this is really the layout of how it worked. The U.S. Marines, we're sitting here the night before. So the air campaign happened, and that was about 30 days of air campaign. We bombed them to try to soften things up. That's the deal. Hopefully people would go. We were the Marines over here. Saudis were with us. The Army's over here, and they're going to do a flanking maneuver. That was the way it was drawn up. But the night before, we're sitting there, and the commander comes out, and he's sitting there saying, the battle projections say 70% of you won't be here tomorrow. You'll be injured, killed, whatever. We were the first wave. Yeah. How many of you would take those odds? How many Marines did? Every one of them. Ultimately, you just gave us a challenge. It doesn't matter what mountain it is or anything like that. You can come in there with any odds, and we believe as a team we are going to win. Whether that's naive or not, and it is, but it was the truth. We're trained, we're ready to go, didn't matter. So we're sitting there, I go, write my death letter, say everything I want to say, seal it up, put it in my pocket. And the death letter, if you haven't seen like more movies or things like that, when you know, again, likelihood you're not going to be here, you want to say everything you want to say before you're gone. Last will and testaments and things like that, we did some of that from, if you had assets, but most of us are poor, so at the end, we didn't have anything to worry about. But from that perspective, told my parents, everybody that I cared about, wrote a nice letter. It's good knowing you. Signed it off. The next day, we're doing the attack. When we meet our replacements, 2nd Marine Division, and there it was on a different map, but shook their hands, showed them around. Real as it gets, right? You know what's coming. Here's where all the radios, here's everything that I have, here's all my equipment. Yep, hopefully you don't have to see it, and we'll be all good. But next day, we're worried about chemical weapons, so over there, the NBC suits, and I have some examples over there. Have a gas mask here. This is surplus that I acquired over time. Put this on. This is your view of the world. You're not taking this off. If you do, well, you don't know. Today I was talking about nerve agents, and in the manuals, I got a couple manuals over there. It says, nerve agent smells like almonds. I don't know who they tested that on and how many people they had to test it on to get that, but clearly they had to, because nothing else is going to tell me it smells like almonds, at least during that time frame. Now we can do chemical analysis and maybe figure out, oh, it might smell like almonds. But that's what we were worried about. The big weapon, if he was going to stop us, really wasn't that. It was this. So everybody had it. We had our NBC suits on. We're out in the middle of the desert, and it's hot. We're in vehicles, and it's hot. At least, I was in a vehicle. I didn't have to walk, so that was a plus. But this is where we were at. And over to the left, we see the line charge hits. So we got a blade tank in the front, M1 Abram. Amp trackers are behind in a single file. This next one actually shoots the line charge over, which is a string of C4. And it looks like that. At the end, I have the short video, sorry, right there. And I'll show it a little bit. It doesn't give it justice, unfortunately. Give it a second. You guys got to take a little bit. Got to check, make sure everything's good before you blow it up, because if that's inside your vehicle, it's not going to be good. So the extra caution here, this is a training video. So at the end, this is probably Camp Pendleton from the looks of it. But I could find it on YouTube. And you'll see the rocket that's over here. That's one of the previous ones. You'll see the power of this thing. So what this does is clear mines ahead of our armor. So that way we can roll through. Once you get through, we let off all the infantrymen, they spread out, and then they start attacking the entrenched Iraqis. That was the goal. So we were doing this, that, and that's that. But this is what has happened. So I said the night before that during this time frame, we were starting to get, the next day, we were starting to get Iraqis, because we quit bombing them, we started getting small groups of Iraqis that were surrendering. And what we were doing was plotting lines. We knew where they were walking wasn't a minefield. So we were sitting there saying, hey, line this up, let's go. Right? And we got so much of this that we actually attacked early, because we were supposed to go at night. But we had so much intel, we're like, we're ready to go. Let's go. So we went early. What we found, though, after that line charge went off, all the others gave up. Right? And beforehand, and I had it over here too, I think, but I have some. Before the war, then the campaign started, we were dropping leaflets telling them what to do. Turn your tank or your stuff around, make sure there's no weapon pointing to us, because if that's happening, yes, we're going to assume you're a threat and we're going to take care of it. But we were dropping these leaflets and saying, hey, surrender. We're good. And that's what we got. So the projections that would have came true if they were really entrenched and wanted to fight us probably would have came true. They were entrenched and everything else, and it would be a totally different conversation today. But they gave up. They weren't invested in dying for this cause. And they gave up, and we went through multiple lines. There were some tank battles, and there were some small, I know some of it was mistakes, like the guys, when we were clearing the trenches, and one of the guys walked in front of a tripwire, and it went off. So then the infantrymen, in their wisdom, decided we're not going to go in all these bunkers anymore. We're going to go old school and roll frags. So they were doing that until they had an ammo bunker. And all of the stuff started going off, and my Amtrak was there. And RPG rounds and everything else are bouncing because they're just flying everywhere. And we're like, don't do that. Is in essence what was said afterwards. You're going to have to clear it the old-fashioned way, right? And do it one-on-one. So there were some slowdowns and some things that were happening, and there were 1,500 or so deaths on the American side during this campaign. Nothing compared to what we're going to see with the Iraqis, but there were things. The other critical events, the oil fires. So, I'm sorry, I lost that. That'll be bigger. So the oil fires, Saddam Hussein said they made a whole bunch of obstacles. A whole bunch of oil was leaked on the ground. They set it on fire. They lit up a whole bunch of them, and this was a good portion of the 90s of the people putting those fires out and then getting the operations for Kuwait back online from an oil perspective. The environmental damage and everything else, a lot of oil leaked into the Persian Gulf. Okay. And all of this stuff was happening. Beforehand, everybody's reading Nostradamus and reading Revelations and everything else, and one of those key stories is the sky goes dark. And we're like, damn, it's dark. And it's hot, and it looks like hell. Yep. So, still wasn't over. We're rolling through, though. And said free Kuwait everywhere. That's a stock photo. I don't know who those guys are, but I found it was pretty good. We had a whole bunch of different slogans depending on where you want. Unfortunately, I lost a good portion of my pictures in a flood years ago. So I got some stuff, and even these are flood damaged. So I didn't have a lot. I had to find some. So we keep rolling on, though. We get to the Kuwait airport. Nice tank battle there. Went back and forth, but ultimately, the T-72s were no match for the M1s. We had better range. You could shoot a lot further. Better optics. Everything was worked out. But we got there, and then we keep going. And this is actually a photo of later in 2006. This is the route that we were given to come back out of Iraq in 2006. This is really what I talk about, but it had it nice and detailed for us to see where this is. But we got all the way to here, and this is the highway of death. We rolled up on this, and you could stand, they said that big long highway, as far as I could tell, this is all you would have saw. This was ammunition to change the mindset of what Americans do. This never made it to CNN. And I'm going to tell you why. As soon as we got to here, nowhere ever in military history have we given up the land we just earned. We got all the way to here, pretty much halfway through Kuwait, and turned around and went all the way back to the border where we started from. Gave up all the property, right? The Saudis and everybody else stayed, but the US, we went all the way back. Why? Because then as soon as, CNN was 24/7 coverage on this thing. However, all of the reporters were kept behind us. And they got really mad, so when we get to Somalia, they didn't want to do that anymore. They wanted to be on the beach and then take pictures and almost got shot doing it. But at the end, that's why this never made it. What happened? CNN switched to Schwarzkopf and all the strategy, oh, yep, we won, it's over, war's over, we're good. And this is why it ends up being, at best, a paragraph in the history books. But it changed people's perception, especially in that region, of who we are. Because these guys weren't coming to fight us. They were running away from us. And that was the only route out. And I'll flip back. You see this road. This is on the east side of Kuwait. I'm going to go back here. The army's coming this way. We're coming this way. The only road they had out was that. So this is why you don't see the massive destruction outside of the front lines where we were bombing them. But that highway is only that one place where they could go. And the Air Force and the Navy and all the air power that we had was just directed on there. And if it was a vehicle and it was moving, shoot it. Didn't matter what was in it. Do you shoot retreating folks? We say no, that's a no-no. But at the end, the military, it comes down to, I can justify it. It's a vehicle, it could potentially turn around and get me later. They just need to reform and come back. If you got a chance, you eliminate the threat. The problem with this is if this was in the US, how much of this stuff would have been scrapped by now? Remelted, reused, repurposed. If you read about it, they're saying, oh, a whole bunch of this stuff is, we shoot depleted uranium rounds. They're dense. They're also radioactive, right? And they're saying, oh, there's a whole bunch of radioactive waste here. Nobody wants to touch it. Really, they don't have steel mills. They don't have the recycling that we do. They don't care. They have oil, they sell it, and that's really their business. The rest of it, they buy from everywhere else. They import it. So this stuff actually stays there. All they did was push it off the road. And before the war, we'd see the same thing. People get collapse, a nice Cadillac, it would get crunched because they just drive at whatever speed they want to. They get crushed, they just push it to the side of the road. And like I said, all the Marines that are poor were like, well, I can get those hubcaps and that would make me money. I can scrap that. But they don't think that way. They just pushed it off the side of the road. And it was still there when we retreated in 2006. Most of this stuff, still there. And now if you look at it from the other perspective, now me as a insurgent or a jihadist or whatever can start writing the narrative that I want to write. Screw history. I'm just going to tell you this is what America does to Arabs. This is what America does to Muslims. Whatever narrative I want to say, now I can show them evidence every day that they go to Mecca, driving through that same area, and say, yeah, just take a quick trip over there, and you'll see exactly what the Americans did. Well, now you have a motivation, a why, to actually motivate people to do things. So before this, if this didn't happen, I don't know. Would the jihadists still be against us? I believe so. I don't think this is one linchpin in the bigger picture. But at the same time, it did give them an easy direction to head, to say what we did. So we did a lot more military campaigns. Sorry, I cut off over there. Ultimately, we stayed in Iraq, and that's usually what's credited. Or we stayed in the region, not necessarily Iraq, with Operation Comfort and a whole bunch of others that we did over that time frame, no-fly zones, all of those concepts. But where were we stationed? In the Persian Gulf, on Saudi soil, and we stayed. This also gave those folks, the Americans are just occupiers. We didn't kick Iraq out till later, or go into Iraq, and then we left. 1992, 93, so Mr. Atif, Mohammed Atif there, he was actually part of AlQaeda and restore hope. So I was actually there in Mogadishu. I have a map of actually the travels that I did from Bardera to Baidoa, in which we were delivering grain. So the concept, we were trying to save starving folks. I made this statement the other day, and Marines don't go anywhere to save anybody. Right? We might have that as a mission, and we'll do it. But really, when somebody sends us there, we're sending somebody to impose will. We have got a whole bunch of dedicated folks that will do anything, naive or not, and then they use that as a tool. And for students, I usually reference this. There's two types of people in the world, tools and those that use tools. We were clearly the tools. However, if you get a good relationship, the tools go both ways. So that's what you should be looking for in business and everything else, is I get to use you as a tool, you get to use me as a tool, and it's mutual. In this case, we are not. Bosnia, we got involved there, and there was also the Islamic movement that was going through. So from the other side, I said, what did jihad find? A new enemy. The communists are gone. They got funded, they got organized. Now they have a whole bunch of people that are motivated with nothing to do. Just the same thing we do with our army. A lot of bad things happen when we have nothing to do. So what do? We hurry up and wait for stuff. We run really hard, and then we get there and we wait. And we argue about it all the time. I tell them, that's us getting there early because you don't want to be late to the party. You get ambushed if you're on that side of the equation. So there is a purpose, but mostly we talk about, hey, we just do a lot of things just to keep ourselves busy, when we could just do nothing. And I argued this point, I already had plenty of experience, but I argued it myself when I didn't understand it. The Yemen bombings, 1992, was the first one accredited really with AlQaeda firmly attacking. They said some of the other ones that were smaller, they didn't take credit for, but people assumed that that's who was behind it. But unless it was big enough where they got news cred, most of the time they stayed out of it. And just, again, they were looking for the news media to broadcast their message. But World Trade Center, 1993, most people forgot that by 2001. You're like, yeah, they already did this once. They just found a new vector. The understanding is that the truck that they tried to do was about 20 feet or a car length away from the support pillar, because the whole concept was to blow up the pillar and then the other building would fall into the second tower. That was the original attack vector. And it was off by there, so I'm assuming probably somebody parked in the spot that it was, and the guy that was driving the bomb was lazy and didn't say, well, maybe I should just park it in the right spot. Didn't understand the ramifications of being off by a little bit. Otherwise, we might have been talking about this as that critical attack vector. But instead, it went on the news. It was a New York problem. The rest of the US was like, yeah, there was a couple dead. We lost the parking garage. No big deal. Ignored what was going on. Car bomb in Riyadh. So they were trying to attack the troops that were still in Saudi Arabia, doing that. I put a blurb down there, the enemy of my enemy is not my friend, because that's ultimately what changed. They're looking to get to us, all shape and form, right, wherever we are. Right now, though, most of this, outside of the World Trade Center, is remote. It's on the news, it's a small tidbit, and you're worried about the fire that just happened in your neighborhood. You're not worried about the national news and what the ramifications are and how this is leading to where we're going to be. Embassies in Nairobi, Kenya, it was a combination attack. Should have shown, again, these are now organized individuals. This isn't a ragtag bunch of groups that couldn't shoot, move, and communicate. They could do it. Still, we ignored it. Now, we really didn't, but we didn't go to war. We were throwing cruise missiles at these folks. in July, and and I couldn't find it unfortunately, but in July, there was an Australian in Afghanistan, which was odd, right, because he was a Western reporter, theoretically, but he was allowed in there, and he was taking pictures of all of the historical relics, right, the big statues and everything else, and one of them just happened to have the weapons cache behind it, and he actually films it. He's saying, yeah, there's the weapons. Now, naturally, we already knew that, but at the end, usually you don't see that. But what he does mention, the next day he couldn't go back because the Australians told him the U.S., we're going to send some cruise missiles in that direction and to stay out of the area because they were going, and he firmly states that. I'm sorry I couldn't find it, but Osama bin Laden. It was on Amazon Prime, and I couldn't remember the name. I watched this summer, so I said I had no intent to, at that time anyway, to talk to this, but it was interesting. The USS Sullivans, so the 5 Sullivan brothers, yep, they tried to attack that ship. Maybe Iowa would have went to war. They got to the ship and said, man, you can't do that. But ultimately it failed. But the key point there, it's in Aden, Yemen. If we see it on the map, this is a strategic point. All of the oil coming out of the Gulf goes through here, goes through the canal, gets into the Med, and then comes over here. We care about it, and we still today, that's why we're dealing with Yemen. If it wasn't for that link, we probably wouldn't care. Okay? Same thing with Somalia, where I was here. We saw the Somali pirates later. They could go and disrupt that traffic with a speedboat and a machine gun. Until we got light of it, and then we're like, yeah, no, we're going to put some Marines right there and some Navy SEALs and say, yeah, have a good time. Your speedboat doesn't meet our, we have better radar than the commercial ships. We'll figure it out. But the Sullivans, the USS Cole, not too long later, 2000 gets bombed. Or they drove a boat up there and blew it up, in essence, is what it was an attack. Right in the same place. We just got and thwarted an attack. We were more vigilant, but at the same time, our challenge when we deal with foreign nations is they're worried about the same thing. Their populace saying, you're occupying us. So it is limited to what we can do to what the foreign nations accept. 2 Tunisians assassinated, ultimately right beforehand. The Northern Alliance and our remaining friend in Afghanistan was assassinated a couple days before, and then we end up here. So clearly it was planned, and clearly it was a progression. Why did we not see it? Because it's just like Pearl Harbor and everything else. When it wasn't on our doorstep, we didn't care. We should, as educated people, start driving that train. At least starting to have a conversation about what's going on. Otherwise, we end up where we end up. So my question is the solutions. Anybody have any? I bring up the sister's concern, yes.
Right after 9/11 happened, the conservative political commentator Patrick Buchanan,
Okay, yep.
he made the comment that, well, the reason the terrorists came over here and did what they did on 9/11 is because we're over there.
Right.
So trying to maybe arrive at a potential solution.
Sure.
If there's going to be any military intervention in the internal affairs of another country,
Right.
or in a conflict between 2 countries, that military intervention, if it has an American face, then America creates enemies.
Yep.
If that military intervention had an international face, for example, a strong UN peacekeeping force,
Right.
then it would be hard for anyone who wanted to take vengeance to single their attention on any one country.
Correct, yep. And that's ultimately what the point was with UN and NATO and everything else, was to divert, to broaden the scope, get everybody that had a common interest on the same plane. The problem comes down to the same solution. Your friend yesterday could be your enemy tomorrow. So, this is why we try to keep the technological advantage for weaponry to ourselves. We'll sell old stuff. We sold the M60 tanks that we left in Saudi Arabia to the Saudis. I said, here you go. We'll buy M1s. But all the Marines, that's what we had, Vietnam era tanks. So we got rid of those, got M1s after that. But we left them there. We said, we're not even going to put them on the boat. You can buy them for whatever, and donated them. But then they said, now they have tanks they didn't have before. And we don't usually give away the M1s or the high-end stuff. But the Israelis, we fund them with F-16s. Some of them are a little bit more direct than just the cash flow concept. But you never know what happens, right? And then ultimately, without having that face, it diminishes it. So in this case, what we're really trying to do with invading Afghanistan and ultimately with Iraq later is show the American people that they're safe again. If you look at it from that way. Is it naive or misdirected? But ultimately, when you get slapped in the face, you slap somebody back, and if you slap them hard enough, you're like, yeah, I won. The problem is, right now, we're not winning. We're walking away, and then 10 years from now, I said, if there was one of those that we fed a whole bunch of, they'd come back at us. Same thing with the Stinger missile. That was high-end tech that could shoot down our own stuff. It just was fire and forget, so we assumed they would use them all, right? But as we find out later with tech, there's smart people everywhere, right? So all they have to do is reverse engineer it and make it themselves. And we see that happen in quite a few instances where we think we have an advantage and then we don't. Nuclear weapons, for instance. That wasn't reverse engineered, it was stolen or sold, depending on how you look at it. But we don't want to give those away advantages. In interest of time, I said thank you for giving me it there. But me, it's education. That's why I'm doing what I'm doing. I question whether or not I would, but at the same time, it comes down to, without knowing, I have this assumption, and I'm going to do whatever I assume. And that's not good. At least if you make an educated choice, you made a choice, a real one. Then if you made a mistake, it's just, I said, at least you thought about it. The other one, and I found this, was, do I not destroy my enemies when I make them my friends? It's the Jesus turn the other cheek type of concept. Did it really? Could we have done something different? That unified face and everything else saying, hey, clearly they were going to condemn this attack. Not everybody wanted to jump in because they have their own problems, especially in Europe, with that same thing. We have the luxury of having two ponds on both sides where nobody can get over real easily. We will see them coming, minus a small group like this. But you want to mass up troops? Yeah, you got a long way to go before you get here, and we're going to see you. Right? So at the end, what should we do, right? Understanding history, understanding the nature of things, understanding people, all the things that we teach here correlate into solving this problem. And that's really what college has always been about. It's educating those folks that we're going to lead the nation into the next decade and so forth. But all of those things fall in there. I want to take a minute just to say a couple other things. Ultimately, there's a cost to what we do. And ultimately, our strengths, as far as there, we are very effective at doing what we do comparatively to what we have done in the past. So there's a lot less of us that actually experience this stuff. But that's a problem when you don't have empathy and really understand, whereas the World War II vets or the Vietnam vets, that whole society understood what the consequences of what they did meant. We don't get that as a populace anymore. We just see it on CNN and sit there and say, oh, yep, we just killed a whole bunch of people, yes.
As a mother of a son who served in Afghanistan 3 times
Right.
in 4 years, not supposed to do that many tours
Right.
in 4 years.
Yep.
What bothers me is that, like for Vietnam, those guys were, they had the draft.
Right.
And I think a lot of people don't take it very seriously because our military in the last,
It's been volunteers. Yep.
volunteers.
Yep.
And I think people don't take it seriously.
Correct. And I agree wholeheartedly. I said I was before, so I don't put myself in that same group because in Somalia and in Desert Shield, Desert Storm, it was clearly one way. We didn't lose a lot of our folks,
Well,
right?
He also served in Kosovo too.
Yep.
He was on base on 9/11.
Okay.
Doing field exercises at Fort Bragg. He's Special Forces Army Airborne.
Right.
So when they heard it come across the radio, they thought it was part of they didn't know until they got back.
That was part of the training exercise? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
They didn't know them, and he was lucky that he lived on base because base was shut down for 3 days. People couldn't get on
Right.
or off base.
Right. Yeah. They said when things happen, most people don't, they said, unless you're part of that or related to those folks, you don't hear about it. There's a lot of effects. But we'll look at the death rates. They said at the end, this is the challenge. Before, you could sit there and say everybody had an associated with somebody who was involved. Now we don't see that anymore. There's very few. And suicide rates. So we talk about this. Right. Oh, sorry. But at the end, it just comes down to, I look at, I said the loss is one thing. You've got to live with the actions that you did for the rest of your life. Even though at the time you're 18, 19, 20, and you don't realize what you're doing, later on it starts resonating, okay? And it doesn't go away. So somebody has to find an out, right? And that's what all of these organizations are trying to do. There's a big campaign right now to sit there and say, hey, there's a whole bunch of people coming back that are going to have some serious challenges because they don't have a need anymore, something that they do, and they were wholly invested in doing what they were doing. And now they're coming back, and this stuff is going to be more and more on the rise, yes.
My son had a traumatic brain injury, post-traumatic stress.
Yep.
It got labeled a few years ago by somebody I will keep nameless, just not to bring up the subject. Got
Sure.
a little headache. I took issue with that.
Right. Yep. Well, unfortunately, this is the challenge, and I think some of the diagnosis is a challenge too. If you haven't experienced some of those things, we can express it, right? But you don't get the gravity of the problem. Even when we're talking to the doctors, you're sitting there and saying, hey, I had some questions about fog and not being able to understand some things. And they're like, oh, well, here's some drugs. I didn't take them because I saw the guy before me getting the same answer. And I'm like, no, I was looking for an answer, right? But I was, I said I had the forethought to think that way. Not everybody else, hey, the doctor said to take it, take it. Well, now you're addicted. Now you're on alcoholism and you're on all the rest of these things to try to cope with the problem, to ignore it. Then you end up homeless and you're out there and you're just there. And if you ever listen to the song Daniel by Elton John, this isn't a new phenomenon. That's what that was about. Daniel coming back and not being able to fit back into society. Me, I buried myself in books, buried myself in something that was constructive, but I can't stop. All I can do is work because I can't stop, because I know the ghost will come. So that's a way for me to keep running against it. But it only works for me. I said some others might, but it only worked for me. I can't give a general solution that way. But ultimately, many of the veterans are going to go through hell in both this life and the next. So you can be here and have a nice, peaceful day. That's ultimately what the price is. My concept, don't waste it. You know it, put in the effort. Whatever that happens to be, whatever solutions you want. I'm sorry, we're right at time, but I'm free to ask questions. And I said I know, answer questions, or I'll show you some stuff. Thank you.
I applaud your grasp of history over the decades starting with the 70s and up to present day.
Right.
So in that time frame of history, you're pretty well studied. And I compliment you for that.
Sure. Thank you.
Many of our fighting men and women, even after they experience a horrendous experience over in the combat zones, they come back and they don't have that historical perspective that you have.
Right. Well, I didn't have this until I said I had to look back, right? And you know, my experience. But yes, I agree.
Yeah. So that leads to my actual question.
Okay.
Which is, what prompted you to be so good at this chapter of history?
Actually, it was just recent. I said, as far as putting all this together, I mean, these were things that I knew and I experienced growing up, right? I said the oil embargo, I was alive during that time frame. You know, it didn't necessarily affect me directly, but I knew because I watched the news, I was informed. And then, you know, it was actually, you know, relatively recently when I'm going back and saying, how do I explain, how did we get here? I knew all those pieces, but I know nobody else really puts that all together and says, okay, well, this is going to lead to here. It's just a whole bunch of different chapters in the textbook, and nobody sees how they all correlate to get to this one point. Everybody gets a little piece of it. And even here, I didn't do it justice. There's a whole bunch of other stories, but we'd be, you know, this is a history class that we'd spend 16 weeks just trying to talk about. And I got an hour, so that was, you know, trying to summarize it. But yes, that was really my call, is to sit there and say, well, I know where I got involved and what I did. But how did even I get there? I didn't know beforehand, minus those. I didn't put it together until later when I could look back. Yeah. Sorry.
I'm just reliving some of the ripples of Operation Desert Storm. When you were writing your death letter, I was an international student in the south of France. Lots of American students, lots of North African Arab students going to the same school together. We heard the announcement that this attack had happened. And, you know, I'm in the south of France, whatever, la, la, la. The next morning, I got up to go for my early morning run, and my habit was to go for my run and then come back and stop at the grocery store to pick up fresh things for breakfast. 7 in the morning, I get to this grocery store, south of France. There are still people alive who lived through World War II. That grocery store was stripped bare.
Yep.
People had bought, like, 7 in the morning. It would look like the Grinch stole Christmas.
Like the COVID last year, yes, everybody rushing to buy stuff.
It was just really such an awakening. People who had lived through war.
Right.
With the threat of, Desert Storm wasn't going to affect the south of France, but that fear.
But they knew.
The next thing that happened is that the North African students who were living there went into hiding. They were terrified of what the American students were going to do to them.
Right, right.
And, you know, when you talk about the fear or the reasons for Arab people to not like Americans, like even the intelligent, intrepid,
Yeah. They're already concerned.
we're scared.
Yep.
Right?
Yeah, we had a similar effect down south. So down south after 9/11, people were, you know, doing stupid crap, and ultimately they're mostly Indians that own the gas stations, but they wear the turban that everybody's starting associated with the Arabs, and that's not true. That's the Indians, and yes, and at the end So they started going there, and these guys had to get on the news. Now we're exactly not them. Quit coming after my store. But people don't understand, and a good portion of it, like I said, this is why I said higher ed, the point is for us to be that guiding light, to understand that the others, right now 30%, of America is graduation, higher ed is what the numbers I got the other day, 36%. Well, the other 60% doesn't have any of that. So somebody has to lead it and do it. We shouldn't follow the politicians. They're supposed to follow us. Right? That's the whole point of democracy, but we don't. We let the media and those guys say the story and stay the narrative, and then we pay the price for it. Right? But ultimately, the way democracy is supposed to work is you're supposed to have an educated electorate that actually votes on issues and understands that not everything's black and white. It's gray. We have voted, we have gerrymandered the moderates out of all of the state policy. It's either red or blue, and they say, oh, it's purple for the first time. No, it's not. It's red and blue, and it just ends up being purple because it's 50-50. But why did they do it? So the moderates, the independents that were actually winning, and people were talking about a third party previous to 2010, we changed the political structure so that those two parties would always have candidates. And now it's extreme because that's who gets through the primaries, and now you've got to deal with extremists here. Yes?
Thank you, Jim, for sharing your story and
Yep.
teaching us a few things. So you had a slide about critical concerns, and you were going to talk about mercy, I believe, and I think that's really important because it's not just education. I'm going to ask your opinion on this.
Sure.
It seems like it's the type of education because the comments you were just making about the media and the politicians is, they are actually the ones of part of the 30% that have a higher education.
Yes.
Right?
Yep.
So just that education alone,
Correct.
not going to put someone in a position. So, what do we do about that? I mean, how can we get the right people, or maybe the right education for everyone? Is that the issue? What do you think?
Well, I think it's, some of it is understanding that I usually use this for business. At the bottom, when you're an operator or, I'm a Marine and all this, I'm an I person. I only care about me. That's all I care about. To get into management, I have to start being a we person, right? And if I do that well, I get to the top and I'm an us person because I've seen all of everybody else's concerns. Now, unfortunately, when you bypass the I and the we and then you just get elected in there and you don't understand all of the tiers to get to that point, now you're at the point. And when you see corporates and all the rest of those, this is what's happening. We have a tiered structure where the top is maintained with their own cycle. They start off at an advantage over everyone else, so they don't have to work through an I position. They're at an I position in an us position, right? Or they're an I person in an us position, and they're doing silly stuff. Whereas when the corporates were smaller and they were 40-1 as far as management ratio, people understood what the workers, there were still problems, the Hershey's, and we'll look at the industrial area and all the rest of it. But at least they had some knowledge of what the workers had. And some of them, like Hershey, was trying to build a utopian society. It just ended up going in a strike, and then he got mad because he's like, I'm doing all this to try to help you, and you spit on me. And then it changed even Hershey's philosophy. So when you start looking at it, you're like, really what you have to do is that empathy and sympathy. So, going out there, and somebody mentioned, going and getting to outside of the country for, the student exchange programs. Going over there to another country and seeing different things. I tell the students, go right over to the line to Mexico. You go to Canada, it's not too much different. Right? But you go right over into Tijuana. Now, Tijuana's got Denny's and a whole bunch of stuff now. If you haven't been there, it's built up. It's more Americanized. But keep traveling. Go to Acapulco, fly in, you'll see a resort that looks like an American resort. But at the end, take the little trips that you have to go out in town, and what do you see? A shack with a makeshift tin roof, and they're all living like that. That's their norm. You walk here, and the only people that are living the substance-driven life is the Amish over here, and they made a choice. They don't want to do it, but they could. They could do what they want to do. It's America. So somebody mentioned the Indians as well, the Native Americans, right? Ultimately, that's another nation under the federal government's protection within the borders. Most people don't get that, but that's their own nation states. But they could choose. Like I said, unfortunately, that's their choice. They want to stay by themselves, that's good. If they don't, unfortunately, I said, history there says, yeah, we were just as evil as in other places. We gave them smallpox and all the rest of those. So what is the real solution? I think ultimately if you experience what everybody else is, and I think that's really where World War II and all those people that are crying when you're burning the flags, because what did they do? They understood what it took to keep that flag flying, and that they were doing good for the rest of the nation by jumping in. Like I said, politics aside. And somebody even asked me that question the other day when I was talking about this, was, why do people join? Some of them have that firm, I'm an American, I'm going to go and do it. After 9/11, everybody signs up. I'm going to go and defend the U.S. Unfortunately, they don't understand what they're getting into. And then as time progresses, we look back and reflect, and we're like, oh, yeah, it wasn't good. And maybe we should do something else. But having some empathy goes a long way. The problem is the smaller these numbers become, the less empathy there is. Even with our own ranks. She mentioned four times, yes? So, I too, and at that time I was one of the very few that had 2 combat tours.
My son made a comment too that when he had gone to, prior to 9/11, okay, the group of guys that he served with he said there was a different attitude. It was really group oriented.
Yep.
He said when he was out for about 14 months, no, for a couple of years.
Okay, yeah.
And then when he re-upped, he said it was like everybody was for themselves. He said that group mentality was not there.
Right. And that's the challenge. He said,
Well, I think it's a societal thing.
It is.
And now we even see it even more. My rights. It's
Yep.
all about me, myself, and I.
Yep. The I people. And when they're driving the train and they don't see it and you allow that to take place, I mean, they have a right to speak. This is America and all the rest of it. The problem is when you start listening and doing what the I say, you're violating all of the we and the us. And before, that was something politicians and everything else would stand against. They don't do that anymore. They listen to the I's, and then we fracture up over and over again. So now we're fighting amongst ourselves. I'll leave you with this, that is ultimately the average government lasts 275 years. We're at 250. And what happens is this same concept. It starts fracturing because the governments and all the group got together with a common cause. In our case, the revolution against England. We got together. That lasts about 5 generations, about 100 years. The next generation, if it wants to continue, is economic. You had to find something to keep people moving forward, right? So we had the industrial era. That got us another 100 years. The last year is entertainment. The last 100 years, or 75 realistically. That's where we are. And when you're just entertained, now it's just me and the internet and all the shows that we can watch and everything else. There isn't that commonality. The 3 channels that us older folks grew up with. We could sit there and say, we had a water cooler moment and we could have a conversation about something. I tried to have conversations with the kids, and like they didn't watch a movie. They watched a YouTube clip that was 8 minutes. Well, I got to adapt my teaching strategy to do exactly that. Sit there and say, okay, well, or just tell them what I tell them, the computer scientist, you're going to do this for 8 hours a day. You're going to have to listen an hour and 20. I'm not playing this game. You're going to have to figure it out. But I give them the why. Ultimately, that's what is missing, right? But yeah, if we can find that, say go out there. It's one of the good ideas, and that guy, I can't remember, a couple slides back, they didn't name. But what we were doing beforehand with the Afghanis during the Afghan-Soviet war, we would bring in foreign, when we still do today, we'll bring them into West Point and we will train them. They're foreign nationals, and you'll see them. They're in their own uniforms, and you'll see them training with all the other officers, learning tactics, learning all the rest of those things. And the point, again, is trying to build relationships so that way we can be friends. In that case, yes, we were doing exactly that. Where did he take all that knowledge? Back to AlQaeda. He said, here's all the stuff I learned from West Point. All right, it's all the kinds of little stories. And I said, unfortunately, yeah, we can go on forever, unfortunately. Any other questions from that front? And I said, I'm more welcome to stick around, but I don't want people to feel obligated.
Remind them about the cookies.
Oh, eat the cookies and take the cookies, drink the water, lemonade. Yes. Yeah.
I don't have another question. Is maybe, hopefully, adding a little insight on the chapter of Saddam Hussein, what was possibly going through his mind when he decided to invade Kuwait in the summer of 1990.
Right.
This is right at the end of the decade of the 80s, where Iraq was at war with Iran. Iraq was actually the aggressor country in that conflict. Iran was our enemy during the 80s, and during the 80s, Saddam Hussein was our ally.
Yep.
We knew the atrocities that he was committing in this decade-long war with Iran. We looked the other way.
Yep, gas, all the rest of those things, yep. Gas his own people.
Yeah.
Yep.
So I think when the summer of 1990 came, yes, Saddam found himself with lacking financial resources, so it was very tempting to invade Kuwait and all their oil wells.
And the banks. Ultimately, the gold and everything else, that was the first thing that left.
Yeah.
They went to all those things, and all that gold went right back to Iraq immediately.
But I think Saddam Hussein thought in the summer of 1990 that the United States is my friend. They're not going to mind if I march into Kuwait.
Right. Yeah, and that's exactly that conversation. I said at the end, they did actually publish the transcripts, but not everything's in transcripts, right? I said at the end, it's a summarization of what was happening and what the conversation was. But they kept it secret for a long time, and that's what added, well, why are you keeping it secret? Clearly something had to be said that wasn't upright. Now today, is it really the original transcripts? Is stuff cut out? Yeah, you're never going to know. I said, they're not going to share that, even if it was just happenstance by mistake of what was happening. But yeah, I said, clearly he had the motivation, and I said it was easy picking. There was nothing to stop him. They were like, oh, well, we rolled in all those tanks. He didn't need all those tanks. He could have rolled in a small militia, a gang from San Francisco roll in there and take that stuff, And I got, my car broke, my brother-in-law's car broke in. He's listening in San Francisco. So I was like, yeah, they're organized. They're going around just breaking into people's cars, and they don't prosecute them anymore. So if you ever go to San Francisco, yeah, don't put anything in your car. Roll down the windows. Let them do whatever, because they'll break the windows and they don't care. Right in broad daylight, right in a parking garage. Didn't care. But yeah, so yes.
So our time's going up
Yep.
now. Although I appreciate your verbosity very much.
Sure.
Thanks for coming, everyone. Next week, same time, 6 o'clock, same place, our very own Joe Scheller is talking. So,
What's the topic?
His topic is, I know, that's why I'm answering.